All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are right at 12 o'clock. So we are excited to kick off our first session of the last day of SUNY Spectrum. We're very grateful to our colleagues from the UNH and Prevention Innovations Research Center, and excited to hand over the virtual microphone to Elizabeth Muscella, who is going to be discussing disclosure of sexual violence victimization among lesbian, gay, and bisexual community college students. So with that, Elizabeth, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very excited to be here. So my name is Dr. Elizabeth Muscella, and I am a research scientist at the University of New Hampshire Prevention Innovations Research Center. My co-presenter Sharon unfortunately is not able to be with us today, so I will be flying solo, and today I will be talking about sexual violence victimization among lesbian, gay, and bisexual community college students, specifically focusing on the rates of disclosure, sources of disclosure, including formal and informal sources, and anticipated social reactions to disclosure. And for the purposes of this presentation, sexual violence will refer to sexual assault, sexual harassment, dating violence, and stalking behaviors. I will also be using the term survivor and victim interchangeably, although I do prioritize the term survivor as it is more empowerment based. So as most of us know, college students who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or LGB, report higher rates of sexual violence victimization compared to their heterosexual peers, with over 30% of lesbian and gay college students and over 60% of bisexual college students reporting some sort of victimization since entering their college or university. Research also documents the host of negative mental and physical side effects resulting from sexual violence victimization. And those can include substance abuse, post-traumatic stress symptoms, as well as academic failure or dropout rates. Recently, a focus on economic outcomes resulting from sexual violence victimization. And that economic loss can often result from the negative mental and physical side effects that result in loss of work, or workplace transitions, or again, academic transitions, dropping out of school that results in a lower paying job, and things of that nature. So specifically for this presentation, we are focusing on community college students. So community colleges enroll higher rates of LGB students. And not only do these LGB students report higher rates of victimization than traditional LGB students attending four-year colleges and universities, but community college students in general, regardless of LGB status, report higher rates of victimization than students attending traditional four-year colleges and institutions. So there's kind of a twofold piece that makes community colleges specifically interesting, and something that we have studied over the course of the past 3-4 years at UNH Prevention Innovations. In addition to this, community colleges have fewer resources, and this can include minimal funding and fewer full-time staff that are dedicated to responding to incidents of sexual violence. So for instance, Title IX coordinators within community college settings often are academic advisors, or they are in HR departments or handling general student academic affairs, as opposed to traditional colleges and universities that tend to have a Title IX coordinator who is solely responsible for addressing incidents of sexual violence on campus. And ultimately, this really highlights the need to study this population because they have access to fewer resources, but at the same time experience higher rates of violent victimization. So recent research has really suggested that victimization may be so high among this population as a result of minority stress, or the unique stress that's faced by members of stigmatized groups, including LGBT populations. And this minority stress consists of internal factors like identity concealment, or internalized homophobia, and external stressors that include actual incidences of harassment and discrimination, whether that is in academic settings or workplace settings. And minority stress really has been shown to contribute to worse mental and physical health outcomes among LGBT populations, which also exacerbates the impact of victimization among this population. So really, it has been attributed to help explain that it increases the susceptibility to victimization through these additional channels of internal and external stressors. And the effects of minority stress have been shown to be more pronounced among bisexual populations in particular, as they experience marginalization from both heterosexual and lesbian and gay communities. And this may include things about negative stereotypes, including that bisexual individuals are more promiscuous, and other stereotypes such as those that may increase the minority stress that they experience, as they do experience it from both communities. And it may also explain why they report poorer mental health and well-being compared to heterosexual populations, but also compared to lesbian and gay populations. So it really does add a specific nuance that for much of the literature has been kind of left out or encapsulated in just the LGBT community. And on top of that, bisexual women in particular are at a higher risk, and in fact, the highest risk of sexual violence victimization. And they also report the greatest amount of post-traumatic stress symptoms compared to lesbian and gay populations, but also heterosexual populations. Fortunately, research does show that disclosure really can mitigate the risk of minority stress on both LGBT populations, but also disclosing sexual identity and having received support can mitigate the impacts of minority stress among this population. And disclosing to others and receiving support may be even more beneficial for LGBT survivors, given that they face stress related to both sexual identity, but also sexual violence victimization. So research suggests that between 75 and 92% of sexual violence survivors disclose their experiences, with the majority disclosing to informal rather than formal sources. So informal sources include family and friends, while formal sources can include medical professionals, law enforcement officers, counselors, victim advocates. They may be confidential or non-confidential sources. And positive social reactions to disclosure are considered the most helpful by survivors and are associated with lower rates of self-blame and post-traumatic stress symptoms. Positive responses are also shown to be associated with better health and perceived recovery among survivors as well. Alternatively, as expected, negative social reactions, including reactions such as blame, may have a greater impact on survivors. And so really, as much as survivors perceive positive reactions being the most helpful to them, receiving negative reactions impacts mental health much greater than positive reactions do. And they have a greater impact on mental health and physical well-being outcomes. And this can include post-traumatic stress and self-doubt. However, to date, much of this research really focuses on the victimization of heterosexual women, and less is really known about LGBT survivors. So the limited research on sexual violence disclosure among LGBT survivors suggests that minority stress creates additional barriers for victims that are trying to seek help. So specifically, LGBT survivors report not seeking help more due to the fear that their sexual identity would be exposed or feeling shame about their own sexual identity. So people are choosing not to disclose more often because of the fear associated with disclosing their sexual identity, as opposed to the fear about disclosing sexual violence victimization. And this research suggests that between 35% and 78% of LGB survivors disclose most commonly to informal sources like friends. And that is very similar to the rates of disclosure among heterosexual women as well. But there are differences in sexual assault disclosure that have been reported between lesbian and bisexual survivors of sexual violence. So compared to lesbian women, bisexual women report higher rates of disclosure. And this study was specific to campus staff, law enforcement, as well as romantic partners. But there's very limited research on the reactions to disclosure among LGBT survivors of sexual violence. And the only study to date that we were able to find that examined some of these nuances showed that bisexual survivors receive fewer positive social reactions compared to lesbian survivors of sexual violence. And these negative reactions, or the fewer positive social reactions, resulted in greater post-traumatic stress among bisexual women who were also victims of sexual violence. So there does seem to be differences within these populations, but to date, very few studies have actually examined it. And so our research team, given this limited research and the fact that the majority of studies have combined samples of lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors of sexual violence, really tried to discover what some of these nuances are. In addition to that, given that the majority of studies have focused on heterosexual or lesbian and bisexual women that are attending traditional four-year colleges, we added to the literature by really focusing on community college populations. So the current study aimed to examine the rates of sexual violence disclosure to informal and formal sources, and the subsequent anticipated social reactions to disclosure among lesbian, bisexual, and gay female and male survivors of sexual violence. So we explored 5 different hypotheses within this study. And the first was that students who identify as bisexual would experience significantly higher rates of victimization than students who identify as heterosexual or bisexual and gay. Oh, goodness, sorry about that, technological difficulties. Our second hypothesis was that bisexual survivors would report worse mental health outcomes than lesbian and gay or heterosexual survivors. The third hypothesis explored rates of disclosure and suggested, given the mixed literature that we found and the very limited literature that we found was more exploratory, that rates of disclosure would simply vary by sexual orientation. And no direction was predicted because the rates of disclosure vary significantly between 35 and 78%. Our fourth hypothesis stated that lesbian and gay and bisexual survivors would anticipate more negative social reactions than heterosexual survivors. And in turn, that heterosexual survivors would anticipate more positive social reactions than lesbian and gay and bisexual survivors. And then lastly, our fifth hypothesis suggested that for all survivors, regardless of LGBT status, higher rates of anticipated positive social reactions would be associated with better well-being outcomes, and higher rates of anticipated negative social reactions would be associated with poorer well-being outcomes. So for this study, we invited community college students enrolled at 7 community colleges in 1 northeastern state to participate in an online survey. And we recruited students via flyers that were posted on campus pre-COVID times, social media posts, as well as an email from the college's Title IX coordinator. So there's one director of all of the Title IX procedures for the community college system that does contain all 7 community colleges. And they had received an email, every single student, from this Title IX coordinator. And the survey was administered via Qualtrics and was expected to take approximately 25 minutes to complete. And the survey inquired about victimization history, specifically since enrolling at their current institution. The survey also inquired about mental health and life satisfaction, the disclosure of sexual violence, as well as the anticipated responses to disclosure, as well as demographic information. And after completing the survey, participants received a list of campus-specific and community resources. and this included the local rape crisis center or domestic violence shelter. And then they had the opportunity to enter a gift card drawing to win one of $50 gift cards. And all procedures were approved by the UNH IRB as well as the IRBs at each of the 7 institutions. There were also several measures that we used as stated, and the predominant measure was the ARC3, or the Administrator Research Campus Climate Collaborative Survey, that was created by researchers at the Georgia State University. And then here are just the citations for the specific measures on mental health, life satisfaction, disclosure, as well as the anticipated social reactions of disclosure. These have all been validated, but again, the majority have been validated within heterosexual populations for college students at traditional four-year universities. So of the 1,500 students who responded, 677 reported at least one incident of sexual violence victimization. The majority participants were women between the ages of 18 and 25. The majority were also white at about 86%, which does correspond with the demographics in the state where the data was collected. And about 80% lived off campus with a partner or child or a parent or family member. And this also speaks to the community college demographic population in which the majority do not have residential housing on campus, and most are commuter students. For male survivors of sexual violence, approximately 74% identified as heterosexual, 15% identified as gay, and about 11% identified as bisexual. And for female survivors of sexual violence, approximately 80% identified as heterosexual, 3% identified as lesbian, and 18% identified as bisexual. Due to the small sample size of LGB men and the sensitive nature of the data that was collected, we combined the samples of men and women to not identify any unique participants. We also had a very low number of transgender individuals or gender non-binary individuals who completed the survey, less than 2%. And so for that reason, we did exclude those survivors from the binary of female and male survivors for this study. So moving on to our findings, so consistent with prior research, approximately 64% of bisexual students reported victimization, followed by 57% of lesbian and gay students, and about 41% of heterosexual students. Chi-square tests of independence were conducted and showed that bisexual students were significantly more likely to experience victimization compared to both heterosexual students as well as students who identify as lesbian and gay. And this does support hypothesis 1 and was consistent with prior research. One-way ANOVAs were also conducted to examine how mental health and life satisfaction vary by sexual orientation among survivors who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And so as shown in this first table, bisexual survivors had significantly lower mental health compared to heterosexual survivors. But there were no significant differences between lesbian and gay and heterosexual survivors of sexual violence victimization. In terms of life satisfaction, bisexuals again reported the lowest, significantly lower life satisfaction compared to heterosexual and lesbian and gay survivors of sexual violence. But as with mental health, there were no significant differences between lesbian and gay and heterosexual survivors. So these findings partially support hypothesis 2, which said that both lesbian and gay and bisexual populations would have lower mental health and life satisfaction. So we did not find that for lesbian and gay and heterosexual survivors. I think somebody may have just accidentally colored on the screen, but we will work through that. Thank you. So moving on, so of the 614 survivors who completed questions on disclosure, approximately 42% of heterosexuals 50% of lesbian and gay survivors and 57% of bisexuals disclosed their victimization experience. So a chi-square test of independence was conducted and showed that bisexual survivors were significantly more likely to disclose their sexual assault compared to heterosexual victims. But there were no significant differences between bisexual survivors and lesbian and gay survivors, nor were there significant differences between lesbian and gay survivors and heterosexual survivors of sexual violence. So the differences were most pronounced among bisexual survivors compared to heterosexual survivors. So in terms of the recipients of disclosure, we looked at several informal and formal sources of disclosure. So the first one we looked at was friends. And there were no significant differences between heterosexual survivors, lesbian and gay survivors, and bisexual survivors for disclosing to friends. However, these numbers do map on quite well to what research has documented for disclosure to informal sources in the literature. However, for romantic partners, bisexual survivors were more likely to disclose their victimization than heterosexual survivors. There were no differences between lesbian and gay and heterosexual survivors in terms of this number. The third informal source was disclosing to family. And here we did see significant differences between both bisexual and heterosexual survivors of sexual violence, and also bisexual and lesbian and gay survivors of sexual violence. So there were significant differences on both of those parts, but again, no differences between lesbian and gay survivors and heterosexual survivors. In terms of formal sources of disclosure, we saw that bisexuals were more likely to report significantly compared to heterosexual survivors to law enforcement, which is also consistent with prior literature. And then in terms of reporting to a counselor, there were no differences for bisexual survivors, but lesbian and gay survivors of sexual violence were significantly more likely than heterosexual survivors to disclose to counselors or crisis center personnel. And lastly, we see significant differences again among lesbian and gay survivors of sexual violence compared to heterosexuals for reporting to college staff. One-way ANOVAs were also conducted to examine differences in anticipated positive and negative social reactions in terms of sexual orientation. So anticipated social reactions that were positive in nature were not significantly different for heterosexual, lesbian or gay or bisexual survivors, which was contrary to what we anticipated in hypothesis 4. However, lesbian and gay survivors anticipated significantly more negative social reactions than heterosexual survivors. Although this graph doesn't quite do it justice in terms of that difference, there was quite a bit of significance there for lesbian and gay survivors anticipating more negative social reactions. And lastly, to explore hypothesis 5, correlations were conducted for each group of survivors to examine the relationship between anticipated social reactions and well-being outcomes. So anticipated social reactions were not significant for either lesbian and gay or bisexual survivors. So the graphics shown on the screen are only for heterosexual survivors of sexual violence. And what we found was that anticipated positive reactions were associated with better mental health, and anticipated negative reactions were associated with worse mental health. And in terms of life satisfaction, we saw the same trend where anticipated positive social reactions were associated with better life satisfaction, and anticipated negative social reactions were associated with poor life satisfaction. And so these findings partially support hypothesis 5, as we expected that the differences would be more pronounced among lesbian and gay and bisexual survivors of sexual assault. So consistent with prior research, LGB community college students reported higher rates of victimization with bisexual students reporting victimization at significantly higher rates than both heterosexual and lesbian and gay students. And bisexual survivors also reported significantly lower mental health and life satisfaction than heterosexual survivors, which again is consistent with prior literature. And these differences have largely been attributed due to the marginalization by both heterosexual and lesbian and gay communities. Bisexual survivors were also significantly more likely to disclose their victimization overall. They were also more likely to disclose compared to heterosexual survivors among romantic partners and law enforcement, and were more likely to disclose to family than both heterosexual survivors and lesbian and gay survivors. However, lesbian and gay survivors of sexual violence were more likely to disclose to counselors and college staff than heterosexual survivors of sexual violence. It's possible that due to the sexual minority stress that LGB students experience, they may seek out additional support for services than heterosexual peers. So it's possible that because the minority stress exacerbates the symptoms that are resulting from sexual violence victimization, they are in seek of services more often than heterosexual victims. And of note, lesbian and gay survivors anticipated more negative social reactions than heterosexual survivors. So it may be that if bisexual survivors were victimized by somebody of another gender, they may not feel the same pressure to disclose their sexual orientation as lesbian and gay survivors. So they may anticipate more negative social reactions due to the fear that their sexual identity would be exposed when disclosing victimization, or that they might receive potentially discriminatory or stigmatizing responses than heterosexual or potentially bisexuals would if they don't feel the need to disclose their sexual orientation when reporting to formal or informal sources. And while the present study furthers our understanding of disclosure, specifically among LGBT survivors of sexual violence, as well as community college students, there were a number of limitations to the present study. So first, the present study did not measure actual social reactions to disclosure from sexual violence victimization. So only the anticipated social reactions were recorded. Future research should really focus on actual responses to disclosure of LGBT community college students to both informal and formal sources of support, as we know that the way that people respond really does have a strong impact on the mental health outcomes that survivors experience. However, anticipated social responses do give us insight into why victims may or may not choose to disclose to specific sources. So it is still an important construct that furthers our knowledge of why people do or do not seek help after victimization, but it may not have the strongest association with mental health outcomes of survivors simply because actual social reactions do have a greater impact on mental health outcomes. Second, although we asked participants about their anticipated social reactions, the wording of the questions themselves did not list specific categories of disclosure recipients. So for example, we didn't ask if you told law enforcement officials or if you told a friend about your sexual violence victimization, how would you expect them to react? So it is likely that the responses would differ when answering questions about informal and formal sources of disclosure. We also did not measure responses to disclosing sexual orientation or sexual identity, which may also have a great impact due to the fear and potential stigma that survivors that are LGBT experience when disclosing, if they do disclose both victimization and their sexual orientation. And lastly, we did not examine disclosure or anticipated social reactions by gender identity. And this is extremely important because we do know that those who identify as a gender non-binary experience some of the highest rates of sexual violence victimization in the United States. So it is an extremely important topic that unfortunately we did not have the sample size to conduct without identifying potential unique individuals within our sample. But we do recognize that it is an extremely important topic for future researchers to examine if and when they have the appropriate sample to do so. So next steps in our research should not only address the current limitations of this project, but should further unpack the relationship between minority stress and the reactions to disclosure. So more research is really needed, especially since none of the positive or negative anticipated social reactions were associated with well-being outcomes for LGBT survivors. So it suggests that there's something else that is going on, that there's additional factors, potentially chronic minority stress, that may overshadow the impact of social reactions among LGBT victims. So it may be that survivors who identify as LGBT may be more distressed over the fear of being stigmatized or discriminated against for their sexual orientation, as opposed to the fear of negative reactions due to the victimization itself. So there really is a need to understand so that we can better provide services for this population. And next steps also really include identifying and offering support services for LGBT students at community colleges who do have a history of sexual violence. And given that there is less access to resources than traditional four-year colleges and universities, there's even more of a need to offer that on community college campuses. This is also extremely important in addition to our findings, is that LGBT populations report more unmet health service needs and more negative experiences with healthcare professionals than heterosexual populations do. And that compounded with the additional stress of disclosing sexual violence victimization really highlights the needs for trauma-informed services. So thank you all for joining me today. I came in a little bit under time, but I do want to acknowledge the funding provided for this project by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Office on Women's Health, as well as thank my co-author, Dr. Sharon Potter, who's the co-director of the Prevention Innovations Research Center at the University of New Hampshire, and to also thank all of the survivors who participated in our study and were able to share and provide extremely insightful information about disclosure, sexual violence victimization, and the sources that they have disclosed to and the potential reactions to those disclosures. So thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, I am happy to answer those.
We did have a couple of folks, if you're seeing the chat, who referenced the news this week about Bill Cosby. And if you wanted to, there's a bunch of different posts about it, if you wanted to give some your thoughts there.
Absolutely. So, oh goodness, I was pulling up the chat so that I can actually look at some of the.
And if you want, you can stop sharing if that'll make it easier for you.
Definitely might make that a little easier.
And then you get to see the chat, no problem.
Yes, absolutely. So I definitely can speak a little bit to that as the release of Bill Cosby has definitely caused quite a stir in our office, as well as the field of interpersonal violence in general. And so we often know from the research that incidents that are public in terms of sexual violence can have multiple impacts and are often multifaceted. So they can have more positive effects because when incidents do happen in the media that are shared, it can often prompt people to disclose, to raise awareness, to in some way almost counteract the negative news that is happening. And so it can prompt people to share their victimization story, to say, you know, it does happen. And as a survivor, I am, you know, extremely hurt by the news and messages such as that to raise awareness. However, it can also have an extremely negative effect in a dual way. So for people that are sharing the news in a more quote unquote positive light, where they're like, things like messages of support that he should have been released, or there wasn't enough evidence for the case, and things along that line. Those people are really discouraging the people that they know who are survivors from disclosing, and really sending these negative messages that they're not a safe person for disclosure, and can result and exacerbate blame that they may feel over their own incident of sexual violence. And it can also have a negative effect in their general feelings and their identity as a survivor of sexual violence. So when receiving those messages that, this is the way that our society responds, this is the way that our criminal justice system responds to survivors, to when people report, in thinking about how our society treats perpetrators, it really promotes these social norms that, perpetrators are protected, that victims do not have a voice. And if they use their voice, the result is going to be negative for them and positive for the perpetrator. So there's definitely quite a mix. And with the use of social media, particularly following the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, there's definitely been more research on the impact of social media. And with cases such as these, oftentimes college students in particular will look to their institution to make some sort of statement. So for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of universities sent out messages of support with resources for students that are multicultural. In the wake of Me Too movement, many universities sent out statements, we stand with survivors, here are the resources we offer on campus, or here are the resources that are provided in our area, national hotlines, things of that nature. But when cases like this are released and universities don't take a stance or promote any messages that support survivors, it can have a backlash effect of survivors' use of resources at their institution. And it can promote a sense of what's called institutional betrayal, where they feel like their institution has let them down as a survivor. And so that can be a really negative impact on survivors' ability to seek help, which again can result in so many mental health and academic failures among survivors.
I want to maybe pull on a thread that you included in that last very comprehensive answer. One of the things that I noted when the decision came out earlier this week was that dozens, hundreds of people who had fairly prominent social media profiles had commented on the substance of it before the possibility that they had read. I mean, this was like a dozens and dozens of pages decision, and the first several dozen pages were devoted to really saying how legitimate the conviction was on the basis of the substance of the conviction. And for those of you who haven't followed it or didn't read the opinion had to do with fundamental due process concerns around an earlier agreement between a former prosecutor and the defendant, Mr. Cosby, and not around the substance of the case. And I'm not saying this good, bad, or otherwise, just that's what the opinion has to be happened to be about. And yet we saw a number of people with much more prominent Twitter followings than I have, who were already giving the facts of it, but those were not actually the facts. And I wonder, I wasn't going to ask it, but you said it, I'm just going to kind of pull on the thread, whether that in and of itself may have a negative impact on survivors coming forward. Whereas if folks had taken a day to read a fairly complex judicial opinion from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, this wasn't like a tweet that the state Supreme Court put out, maybe could have written about it in a way, and maybe it's still bad, and there's still some significant issues around the private discussions between the prior prosecutor and the defendant and his attorney and the role of wealth and the like. Taking that aside, it would be different from the testimony of the victim survivor in this case having been sort of nullified. So can you dive into that? Because that's something that I wanted to kind of pull on that thread.
So absolutely. So I mean, I think, you know, any support that's shown for perpetrators, regardless even of conviction, and I see in the chat some people are mentioning Brock Turner and things like that, previous cases of sexual violence. I think regardless of even how much evidence there is, there's a persona of believing survivors. And I think there's a lot of falsification around how many reports are true. The truth is that only 2% of any sexual violence reports are false. And the majority of survivors never actually report to law enforcement whatsoever. So I think any post that's potentially supporting the release can have negative impacts on, this person, feeling invalidated as a survivor of sexual violence. And so I think even without any of the, knowing any of the details of the case, without reading any transcripts, I think having a say and making a comment or an opinion about the case itself, regardless of how many details you include or that justify why you feel what you feel, or your support or your lack of support for the decision. I think when survivors see those messages, whether they're from celebrities, whether they're from news sources, whether they're from friends or family members, that all impacts, the role of social media impacts so much of people's identities. And I think as a survivor, when you read posts that are marginally close to anything about, sexual violence, whether it is even an unrelated post about somebody, there's a lot about, for instance, like Johnny Depp, and even some people saying, like the new Johnny Depp movie was great. As a survivor, people can feel invalidated by that simply because he has been accused of perpetration for domestic violence. And so I think that people pull these messages and receive these messages, even if that might not be the intention, or even if people misspeak or don't know all of the facts. But I think people, survivors are able to pull that and tie that into, and it impacts the way that they think about their own identity as a survivor, who they've told, and there can often be a disconnect between, people who may have supported them or believed them, and then, are commenting on the release of Bill Cosby. Or it might have been the opposite, where people may have not supported them or reacted poorly because maybe the perpetrator was somebody that they knew, but then are taking a stance on the Bill Cosby case. So I think in more of a vague way, any messages related to this do impact survivors who see it, whether it is positive or negative. And it does cue survivors to think, this person may or may not be a safe person to talk to. This person may or may not be somebody that I want to share with or get to know more or follow on social media, and things of that nature. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't want to, social media impact is only somewhat in my wheelhouse. So I don't want to be misinformed on the impacts. And I, again, have only followed the case with Bill Cosby so much. And again, don't want to misspeak on not knowing everything, because I have not done an in-depth dive on the transcripts that have been released either.
One of the questions that came into the chat from earlier in your presentation, why does it seem that bi and lesbian and gay victim survivors disclose more than heterosexual victims and survivors?
Absolutely. So part of the reason that we speculate and that research has speculated is simply because of the role of minority stress. We know that just in general, regardless of victimization status, people who identify as LGB report more stressors. They report more negative mental health. They report lower life satisfaction, quality of life. And so these struggles are already going on regardless of victimization. And when victimization is compounded with that, minority stress can exacerbate the negative outcomes that result from trauma. So if you are already experiencing, a low quality of life, and then victimization occurs, where you start and the impacts that it will have will have an even larger impact on your ability to cope with that traumatic event. And so what we've speculated and what some prior research has speculated is that because they are experiencing worse mental health, there's a need, it's more apparent the need to seek services. And that need, you know, really can be disclosing to informal or formal sources. We also speculate that for bisexual survivors in particular, if somebody has perpetrated against them and they are not a person of the same sex, that they more relate to the disclosure of some heterosexual individuals where they don't feel necessarily the fear of disclosing, but also simply too because they do report more victimization. So it was not reported in this study, but when analyzing the data that we did collect, bisexual women in particular were also more likely to report more victimization. So not only higher rates, but also 3 or 4 times the amount of sexual violence. So not just one sexual assault, but 3 sexual assaults, or not just one sexual assault, but sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. So there's also more instances and more chances for them to actually report to law enforcement or to medical professionals if they are injured from an assault and things of that nature, which could also be contributing to some of those higher numbers. Also, there hasn't been too much literature on this, but there was a paper that I did read in preparation for this study in which bisexual, lesbian, and gay survivors also tend to experience more severe forms of violence. So meaning that they might be more likely to be physically injured. There's more likely to be a weapon involved. And there's also compounded nature of potential hate crime and sexual violence. So there has been some data to show that among perpetrators that there is some mentality of like, you know, I'm gonna make them straight by violating them, by, you know, engaging in sexual assault or rape or violence of some nature. And so with the compounded, you know, victimization and sexual identity, that violence can be more severe and again have a more severe impact, which might justify the need to disclose and seek more support simply to balance the negative impact that it's having.
Another question that came in, I'm curious if the research tracked the gender identity of the people who assaulted their partners and if trends or patterns were seen there.
So we do have that data. It was not reported in this study, but we do have that data and did find that men were the most likely perpetrators of violence. And that included among lesbian women as well, which does provide some support for potentially the compounded, you know, hate crime element of sexual orientation compounded with sexual violence victimization. And so in the study, over 90% of the perpetrators were male. And that was regardless of sexual orientation. So across the board, over 90% were male, which was something that is consistent with prior research. And we are still kind of analyzing some of this data to track potential trends in disclosure among perpetration status, not only in the gender identity of the perpetrator, but also in the relationship status for somebody who was a fellow student versus we have data on faculty and staff members versus data on like a stranger assault, which is less common, but still does happen. So we're still in the midst of analyzing the more nuances that accompany rates of disclosure among these populations.
Okay, and I'm just looking through, there's quite a number of people who thanked you for the research and for the presentation. I'm just looking through, and a reminder that folks can either send questions to me, Joseph Storch, or can send it right to the chat. If you send it to me, obviously it'll be completely anonymous. There's quite a lot here. while we wait for more questions, the Preventions Innovations Research Center is always innovating. You know, we've known Jane and Sharon for 1,000 years, it seems like, and there's always innovations. So tell us a little bit about what's next on the dance card for the PIRC and for some of the research you're doing, and what folks can look forward to maybe hearing about in Spectrum 2022.
Yep, absolutely. So we are very interested right now in looking at the intersection of multiple identities. So minority stress impacts not just sexual identity, but also in particular the current climate in the US, racial identity right now. It has for generations, but has in the past several years been really brought to the forefront. And the same types of institutional betrayal and minority stress that accompanies issues around sexual violence and LGBT status are also very true of racial minority populations. And so we're very interested in looking at the intersectionality of these pieces to really understand which identities are the most impacted and most impact disclosure and ability to seek services. Because we know, similar to LGBT populations, that racial minorities are also mistreated by the system, whether it's the criminal justice system as in sexual violence, whether it is unmet needs from medical professionals when seeking services. So really looking at the impacts of multiple identities among survivors to understand how we can best make prevention efforts, but also bolster the response that these communities are experiencing. So in addition to that, we are working on several projects with adolescents right now, which has been very exciting. And we are hoping to really increase prevention efforts among youth, as we know from conversations with colleges in particular, that they're like, by the time students get here, so many of these messages are already ingrained. So much prevention needs to happen earlier on, which is actually a great segue into the next presentation with One Love, because we have been collaborating with them for the past year and are actually working on some exciting projects with them in the future, very near future. And so we are working to examine some of their prevention efforts as well, and have had some great partnerships with them and preventing violence among adolescent populations. In addition to that, we are also working on some exciting projects looking at in terms of faculty, academia, and particularly in the STEM fields, and issues around racial identity, gender identity, and the harassment and violence that follows in those fields, and what we can do to attack some of the nuances within the STEM field to prevent and support individuals who are working to promote career success among them as well. So quite a few things happening right now that we are very excited on working with and moving forward.
A lot of good stuff there. We're very interested at SUNY, as you might imagine. We do a lot of STEM, so we are very interested, I think, in that, because there have certainly been historical challenges in those fields that need to, that should be addressed, and so we're very interested in that. Do you intend to go back to this study on any type of calendar to kind of see longitudinal changes?
So the data that was actually presented in this study was the end of a longitudinal study. So we had collected data previously, about 2 years before this data was collected. Unfortunately, because most of the colleges that we're working with only enroll students for 2 years, as opposed to 4 years, it's harder to track those participants after they have graduated.
I'm sorry, I misspoke on the longitudinal. And you're 100% right. I just meant to go back to see whether societal changes would affect, obviously, a different cohort. Again, apologies for misspeaking.
No worries at all. Absolutely. So that is something that we are very interested in, especially with everything that has happened, this past year, and a lot of the social movements around different identities, racial identity, ethnic identity, and the different movements that have happened, and the impact of those movements on survivors moving forward. So we are very interested in still looking at that, and potentially looking at, again, the greater impact of social media on disclosure and instances such as that, particularly among more marginalized groups.
A question that came in: based on your research, do you have any suggestions to increase support or more targeted support?
Absolutely. So I think particularly in the time that we're in with LGB, it tends to be an issue that's now coming up where organizations are, the pride flag is posted on everything. And there's been some backlash for organizations that actually donate to anti-LGB organizations, but yet use the pride flag during the month to increase, viewership of their channel or engage different audiences to increase sales and things like that. And so I think even though a lot of spaces say, like we are safe places, we're safe spaces for people to share their identity, to seek help, to seek support, I think there is some resulting skepticism that has occurred more recently simply because of people's misuse and mistreatment of, being a safe space. So I think a lot of the organizations that we're working with to promote diversity and inclusivity have been, being publicly at the forefront to say, to make their resource known and to take a stance on these movements. So in the public eye, they're not just, posting a pride flag saying, we're a safe place, but to really more actively engage the community, to actively take a stance to engage community members so that they are recognizing not just once, not just during Pride Month, but repeatedly that this is a safe place and a safe space to share my identity, to disclose, to potentially reduce some of that fear that people have when disclosing victimization, that I will be outed, I will be discriminated against.
It is hard when we've seen such a shift in just 5 years. When we launched Spectrum, there were no companies on my Twitter feed who had changed their logo for the month of June. For this fourth Spectrum, I can't find a company that is using their standard logo. And there's no good housekeeping seal of approval for what is legitimate and what is marketing. And I can't imagine you have a way of discerning right now between, is Papa John's pride flag more legitimate than Domino's, more legitimate than Pizza Hut's, more legitimate than, you name it, I don't know, the local pizza place?
Exactly. And I just saw somebody in the chat who was like, what can we guarantee, like safe from what, safe from whom? And I think that is a question that is in a lot of people's minds, particularly in Pride Month, when it seems to be, almost the popular thing to do. In the past 5 years, it's grown from, like, oh, you have a pride flag to why don't you have a pride flag? And I think that, making sure that, it's not just during Pride Month, but it's an active, ongoing effort to reach out to communities who need it, to make statements on issues when they come up, to say, this is our stance. Because I think when that silence occurs, when organizations and institutions don't show support for those communities when instances happen, they're sending a message that that's not a priority, or, maybe there's too much of a monetary investment at stake to make that stance. And that's more important than the way that we value LGB, communities. And I think those messages really do resonate, similar to, when there's silence about, the Bill Cosby case or any popular case in the media, like that silence resonates. As much as taking a stance, whether that stance be positive or negative. So I think making those efforts to actively include and speak out on those issues can engage people of that community to say, I feel like this is an organization that I can trust.
Over 12 months, not just that 1 month.
Yes, exactly. All year round, when instances happen, when hate crimes occur, to say, we don't support this, we don't support the way that it was handled. And I think a lot of people fear doing that for the sake of losing people, but I think sometimes those messages can be necessary because that silence, can be deafening for a lot of people who say, it's great that you might support this during Pride Month, but year round, if I come in, is that going to be, a problem? And so I think that that can be one way to engage those populations more readily.
Well, Dr. Elizabeth Michela, we are so grateful for you joining us here at Spectrum. Someone noted in the chat earlier the absolute overrepresentation of high quality Elizabeth speakers that we've had over the course of this conference. We have one Elizabeth in the audience who's applauding for that, and thank you. And we hope that as you have more stuff, and I'm pretty confident that we will see you and your colleagues, God willing, in person at a future Spectrum conference. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
And we will give everybody a half an hour to check your email, to check social media, to take a break, run a lap around the block, whatever you need to do. We will see you back here at 1:30 here on the East Coast. Our friends and colleagues at the One Love Foundation will be doing their workshop, and we are excited about that. We are also excited to see what comes out of work between One Love and Prevention Innovations. I'm personally take a lot of pride in that, because I remember when they started talking, when the two groups started talking 4 years ago at one of these Spectrum conferences. So we will see you all back here at 1:30. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that great presentation. And we will see you in about a half an hour.